The sound reached her before anything else did. Jenny Caruso had been blind since she was 11 years old, and in the 22 years since, sound had become the architecture of her world. She knew the weight of silence the way other people knew the weight of furniture, by the space it occupied, the specific way it pressed against a room. She knew the difference between a desert that was empty and a desert that was holding its breath. Tonight, the desert outside Palma, Arizona was holding its breath. She set down her coffee and tilted her head. The dog, a 3-year-old shepherd named Sable, had gone still against her shin, not the coiled stillness of a threat response, something else. Something closer to reverence. Then the sound came again. It wasn't a crash exactly. It was the sound a crash would make if it were embarrassed about itself. A skipping, grinding impact across hardpan about 2 kilometers east, followed by a long silence, then a single high tone, clean as a tune fork, that dropped below the threshold of hearing and kept going, vibrating in the bones of her jaw, her sternum, the soft place behind her eyes where headaches lived. She already had her coat on before she consciously decided to go. 3 capsules had hit the earth in a line, like stones, skipped across a pond. Colonel David Marsh got the call at 11:47 p.m. and had 40 soldiers on the ground by 1 a.m., which he later described to his debrief as a textbook response time. What he did not describe, because he had no language for it, was the way the 3rd capsule had opened. Not exploded, opened, like something inside it had decided to. His night vision feed showed a shape. Small, no taller than a child, wrapped in something that caught light wrong, that seemed to absorb and emit simultaneously. It moved with the cautious, deliberate economy of something that was hurt and knew it was hurt, and was trying very hard not to show it. It had looked at the ring of soldiers and their rifles. It had looked for a long time, then it had walked away from them. Not run, walked. Marsh ordered his men to pursue and contain. 40 soldiers in 3 trucks, and 2 helicopters converging on a damaged, apparently unarmed entity the size of a 12-year-old. The entity did not stop walking. "Sir," said Corporal Eddowes, who had a daughter in 5th grade, and would much later think about this moment often. "It doesn't look like it's threatening anything." "Eddowes," said Marsh, "I didn't ask you what it looks like." Father Howard had been the priest at Our Lady of the Desert for 16 years. He was 61 years old, built like a retired plumber, and possessed of a theology that had evolved considerably since seminary. His current working understanding of God was that anything sufficiently complex that moved toward the light, rather than away from it, probably deserved some latitude. He was watering his tomatoes at 2 in the morning, insomnia, a lifelong companion. When the shape appeared at the edge of his garden, he did not scream. He did not reach for his phone. He did a thing that surprised him afterward. He pulled a chair out from the garden table, the old iron one, and set it in the dirt facing the shape, and then he sat down in the other chair and folded his hands in his lap. "You look like you've had a long night," he said. The shape stood at the garden's edge for a long moment. Then it came and sat in the chair he'd pulled out, and the motion of it, that careful, exhausted lowering, hit Howard somewhere deep and specific. He had watched his father sit down like that in his last year of life. That particular economy of a body that has used almost everything it had. He did not know what it wanted. He did not know what it was. He knew that it was hurt, and that it had chosen to come to a place with a light on, rather than a place with the light off, and that seemed like a meaningful thing to honor. "I'm going to get you some water," he said. "I don't know if that's what you need, but it's what I have." Jenny found them at 3:15. She had walked the 2 kilometers east following the tuning fork hum, lower now, irregular, like a signal with a failing battery, and then followed it back west when it moved, which she understood as tracking without thinking of it as tracking. Sable walked steady at her hip. The desert smelled of creosote and cold metal, and something underneath both of those things. Something she had no name for, but that made her think of the moment just before music resolves. She heard Howard's voice from 30 meters out. Low and steady, the voice he used for the rosary when he thought no one was listening. Not prayer exactly, something more like company. She stepped through the garden gate. Sobel sat down. Jenny stood still and listened to the shape in the chair across from Howard, and what she heard was not sound, exactly. It was the absence of the right sounds, a breathing pattern in the wrong register, a stillness that was too complete for any animal she'd known, and underneath it, that hum, now close enough to feel in her molars, slow and faltering, an SOS in a frequency nobody had ever thought to build a receiver for. She had spent her whole life building receivers. "It's scared," she said. Howard looked up. He hadn't heard her arrive. Jenny, don't, she said quietly. Don't get up. Don't change the temperature. She moved to the third chair at the garden table, the little iron one she'd sat in 100 times during the pastoral emergencies that seemed to find Howard's garden at inconvenient hours. And she sat down and she placed both her hands palm up on the table, between herself and the shape in the opposite chair. An offering, or a question, the gesture that meant, I am not holding anything, I am not a trap. For a long moment nothing happened. Then something that was not a hand touched the back of her left hand. Cool. 3 points of contact where a human hand would have 4. A pressure so careful it was almost not there. And the hum changed pitch and she understood. Not in language, not even in image, but in the way you understand a chord is in a minor key. That it was afraid, yes, and hurt. And that it had come from a very long way, and that somewhere out there was something looking for it, and that the looking was taking too long. She turned her hand over slowly. The 3-point pressure shifted and held. Okay, she said to both of them, to all 3 of them. Okay, we need to figure some things out. Marsh found the church at dawn. Not the garden. They'd missed the garden, which Howard would later describe as the Lord's own obstinacy regarding shrubbery. But the military's thermal sweep had caught 2 human temperature signatures, and 1 signature it couldn't categorize. And the categorized ones had moved inside, and the uncategorized one had moved inside with them. And the church was the only building on this section of road. He stood in front of Our Lady of the Desert with 22 soldiers and 2 vehicles and felt, with a professional clarity he had developed over 30 years of service, completely uncertain of his next move. Sir, said Sergeant Chen, who was also thinking of her daughter but trying not know. The doors are open. They were, both of them. Wide. That was the thing that stopped him. A closed door would have given him a protocol. An open door just stood there, being open, offering nothing to push against. He walked in alone. The nave was lit with the kind of early morning light that comes through east-facing stained glass, and doesn't belong anywhere else on Earth. Long and colored, falling in columns through dust that had been disturbed recently, and was still settling. The smell of old wood and candle wax and something underneath it, something he couldn't name but that made the hair on his forearms stand up. Howard was in the first pew. He looked like a man who had been awake all night and had made his peace with it. The blind woman was in the second pew, facing forward, her hands in her lap. Her dog lay across her feet. The entity was not visible. Father, said Marsh. Colonel, said Howard. He had done some research or had been told or had guessed. His voice was conversational, without performance. I need you to tell me where it is. I imagine you do, said Howard. Father. I'm not asking as a matter of debate. I know. Howard looked at him with the uncomplicated honesty of someone who has already thought through the consequences and accepted them. And I'm not refusing as a matter of obstruction. I'm telling you, I don't know exactly where it is right now. It moves without making much sound. What I know is that it's in this building, and that it is afraid, and that it has not threatened anyone, and that I am asking you, as a request, between 2 people, to give me a little more time. Marsh looked at the woman in the second pew. She had not moved, ma'am, he said. Are you in any danger? She turned her head toward him with the particular calibration of someone who has learned to center her attention precisely on the location of a voice. No, she said. Can you tell me what it wants? She was quiet for a moment, not hesitating, processing, the way people process something that doesn't have a direct word. It wants what everyone wants when they've been in an accident far from home, she said. It wants someone to know where it is, so they can come get it. The thing Marshap sat with for the rest of his life, and he lived to be 87, and remained in the main an honest man, was this: he had come into that church with a problem that his training had given him a framework for. Threat, containment, neutralization. The framework was clean and comprehensive, and he had believed in it the way you believe in a load-bearing wall. And in the space of 20 minutes in a desert church at 6 in the morning, the framework had simply ceased to apply. Not because the threat was gone. He didn't know if there was a threat. That was the problem. He had sent 40 soldiers after something he had decided was a threat without ever establishing that it was. And now he was standing in a church nave in colored morning light, and the only evidence he had was a blind woman who said it was scared and a priest who had given it water. He sat down in the pew across the aisle from Howard. Howard looked at him, sidelong, and said nothing, which Marsh had the distinct impression was a pastoral technique. How long, Marsh said, does it need? Howard turned to look at the woman. The woman cocked her head slightly. The hum, which Marsh couldn't hear but was beginning to understand, was there, did something. A few hours, she said. Maybe more. Something's looking for it. The signal isn't strong enough. What signal? She put one hand against her sternum, flat, like she was checking her own heartbeat. It's been broadcasting since it landed. I don't know what frequency. Something biological, I think. Something that goes long distances. She paused. It's getting weaker. Marsh looked at his hands. He thought about the Corporal Eddowes, and what she'd said on the comms, and how he had shut her down, and what that had cost both of them in terms of the next hour. Tell it, he said, and his voice came out quieter than he'd intended, that I'm pulling my men back to the perimeter road. That's about a kilometer, that I'm. He stopped, searched. That I'm going to need something to tell my command. Something that isn't a threat assessment. Can it give me that? The woman sat still. The colored light moved as a cloud shifted outside. Sable raised his head. Then something happened to the air in the nave. A change in pressure, very slight. The way pressure changes when a large window opens in a closed room. Marsh felt it in his eardrums. He had time to become aware of something standing in the aisle beside his pew, very close, and then something touched the back of his hand, where it rested on the pew back. 3 points of contact. Cool. Extraordinarily careful, he did not move. He sat with the touch on his hand and breathed through it, and the thing he felt, which he never, not once in his remaining 46 years, described in any official or unofficial context, was simply, I see you. Not words, not even quite a thought, a fact, transferred directly, I see you. He kept breathing. The pressure lifted. He turned his head and there was nothing in the aisle. They waited 4 hours. Howard made coffee. Jenny tuned the old upright piano in the corner of the nave, a thing she had done dozens of times, running her fingers over the keys in a particular slow sequence, tightening what needed tightening, checking by ear alone. And then, because the silence had become its own kind of weight, she began to play. Nothing special. An old folk song she had learned from her grandmother. Something her grandmother had learned from hers. A chain of women passing a melody hand to hand backward through time like a rope bridge. Simple and sturdy, and a little sad in the way that things are sad when they are also beautiful. She heard it from across the nave. A change in the hum. Harmonic. Responsive. Like a second instrument finding the key. She played the song twice through, and on the second time the hum settled into it, not matching the melody but threading underneath it. The way a cello threads underneath a violin, supporting without competing. She did not know what music meant to it, if anything. She knew that it was leaning toward the sound the way plants lean toward windows. That was enough. The second signal came at 10:14 in the morning. Jenny felt it first. A massive bass note from somewhere high above. Something that was not sound but occupied the space where sound would be. Like a door opening at the top of the world. Then Marsh's radio crackled with Air Force reports. An unidentified object at high altitude, stationary, not responding to hails, not descending. Waiting. He stepped out of the church, into the hard desert morning, and looked up at nothing he could see, with the naked eye, and felt the full weight of what he was standing in the middle of. Not a threat assessment, not a containment problem, not any of the frameworks. Just a moment in history that would be classified and buried and redacted until nobody was alive to read the original, and the plain truth of it, which was this. Something very far from home had needed help, and 2 people who were broadly considered marginal, a blind woman and an old priest, had given it, and now something was going to go home, and the 40 soldiers on the perimeter road would go home too. And Marsh himself would go home and have a normal breakfast and file a report that said things like inconclusive, and no evidence of hostile intent and situation resolved without incident. He walked back into the church. The entity was visible now. Small, the silver of its suit was dull in the morning light, scuffed from the crash. It stood with a stillness that he recognized now not as absence but as presence, the profound stillness of a mind that was fully, completely somewhere else. Then it came back, and it looked at Jenny. She turned her face toward it with no hesitation, as if she had been watching it all along. What passed between them in the next 30 seconds was not something Marsh could describe. He watched Jenny's face. He watched her expression move through something, not grief exactly, and not joy exactly. The word that kept returning to him later was recognition. The face of someone who has finally heard the word for something they've always known. She nodded once. Then she started to cry, very quietly. And she was smiling at the same time, and Marsh understood that this was not distress but something else entirely. And he looked away to give her the privacy of it. When he looked back, the entity was at the door. It paused. It turned, and in the movement there was something. A tilt of the head. a quality of attention that Marsh had seen thousands of times in hundreds of departures. The last moment before someone walks out a door. The pause before the irreversible. Marsh raised his hand. The entity regarded him for a moment. Then it did something with one arm. Not a wave, not quite. Something slower and more deliberate. An acknowledgement, a noting. Then it walked out into the desert and the door was still. The Air Force tracked the object for 4 minutes and 20 seconds before it cleared low Earth orbit. After that, nothing. The tracking station at Edwards sent 2 more reports, then went quiet. Marsh drove to his command post and wrote the first draft of what would become a 40-page classified report, concluding that the event was a probable meteorological anomaly compounded by instruments malfunction and civilian misperception. He was aware as he wrote it that this was not what had happened. He filed it anyway, because the alternative, the accurate version, would have required his command to do something with a truth they did not have a category for. And the absence of a category would have meant something worse than silence. He filed it and drove to a diner and ate eggs and sat for a long time, over coffee. He left a large tip. He didn't know why. It seemed important to do something with his hands. Jenny kept teaching. She had 14 students that fall, ranging from 7 to 63, and she taught them with the same patient attention she had always brought to the work. The young boy who played everything too fast. The retired accountant who played everything too slow. The teenager who could already hear harmonics that most adults never would. She corrected them and encouraged them, and sat beside them on the piano bench in the specific companionable proximity of people sharing a sound. On quiet evenings, when the desert was doing that thing it sometimes did, holding its breath, waiting, she would sit at the old upright and play the folk song again. The one from her grandmother. She played it slowly, feeling for harmonics, listening for something threading underneath. Sometimes, in the lowest register, just at the edge of what she could hear, she thought she caught it. A response from somewhere in the register below sound, not language, not even quite music. Just I hear you. She would sit with it the way you sit with something you can't prove but also can't let go. Then she would reach up and tune the string that always drifted flat and play the song from the beginning. The desert outside was dark and full of light, and the signal she knew traveled a very long way. It did not need to be strong. It only needed to be true.